Hi, I'm Richard Wassam, Education Officer, Student Support. Today I'd like to briefly run through some of the key points for writing a student learning plan. The slides today are based on a document shared with schools late last year called the Annotated Learning Plan, a quick guide for completing each of the major components of the learning plan. If you don't already have a copy of this, please see the Student Support Coordinator at your school. During this video, I'm going to try and give you examples that are different than those that are included on the Annotated Learning Plan document, just to expose you to a variety of ways to say similar things. Today I'll be referring to the most commonly used learning plan pro forma in Tasmanian Catholic schools. Essentially, this plan has three parts. The first page is a snapshot of the most important background information that someone new to the student, such as a new teacher or a relief teacher, needs to know. The second page of the learning plan documents all of the adjustments that are being made to enable the student to access and participate in the learning environment on the same basis as their peers. This includes both the academic and social aspects of the learning environment. The first two pages of the learning plan are great sources of information to give to a relief teacher at the beginning of the day. They also provide a great starting point when determining a student's NCCD level of adjustment, and will likely be one of the first documents an auditor looks at if the school gets chosen for an NCCD audit. The third and final page of the learning plan is where we document the goals that have been determined collaboratively by the teacher and parent, but may also include the student, the TAs, allied health professionals, or anybody else who supports the student. I'm now going to talk about each of these pages in more detail, providing some pointers to hopefully make it easier to write a learning plan that both reflects and informs your classroom practice. The first 6 boxes on page 1, student name, date of birth, grade, teacher, school, and learning plan date, are all pretty self-explanatory, with the information being readily accessible to most teachers. The reason for adjustment box is there to identify why the teacher has chosen to write a learning plan for the student. In many cases, we're writing the learning plan because the student has one or more disabilities, and these need to be identified in the box. Where a student has more than one disability, I suggest writing them in the order of their impact on the student, starting with the one that has the most impact and working backwards. If the student has been included in the NCCD, put the level of adjustment and broad category of disability here. It's important that this information matches what has been reported on FileMaker, so if you're not sure, please ask the Student Support Coordinator. If the student has a learning plan but is not included on the NCCD, such as a learning plan for giftedness, EALD, ATSE, then please put NA in the boxes. These are pretty self-explanatory. Based on the data you've received on this student, indicate whether they are at, above, or below grade level for each of these 3 areas. Some students need specific adjustments to allow them to access tests and other assessment tools such as PIPS, NAPLAN, or everyday classroom assessments. This box allows you to document what adjustments are necessary in testing situations. Please include detail where necessary. For example, if the student needs extra time, give an indication of how much extra time is needed. For example, give Johnny an extra 5 minutes for every 20 minutes of testing. This information might come from a recommendation in a specialist report or from your experience as Johnny's teacher. Again, if no adjustments are needed in this area, please indicate by putting an NA in this box. Now we're getting to some of the meatier parts of the learning plan. No matter what additional needs a student has, they will always have strengths and areas of interest that we can use when designing tasks or adjustments. The current skills, strengths, and interest box is where we document these things. This can be a list of dot points, but please be sure to include enough detail to make the information useful. Too many times I've seen learning plans that list some skills as a strength, but lack the detail to really be useful. For example, rather than just saying gross motor skills, identify specific gross motor skills such as can bounce a large ball with one hand, can catch a medium-sized ball thrown underarm from a meter away, can walk on a balance beam with assistance. Teachers will primarily list skills and interests that they observe at the school, but parents can also contribute to this box by identifying skills and interests they see at home. This box is used to identify the specific challenges that this student faces while at school. Just like the strengths box, it is important to include enough detail to paint a very clear picture of each challenge. For example, rather than a dot point that says numeracy, a much better dot point would say something like, is able to perform addition and subtraction tasks using two-digit numbers with concrete aids but has yet to develop mental math strategies such as friends of 10, counting on, etc. It is also important that the language we use is positive and non-judgmental. This can sometimes be a bit tricky, especially when talking about challenging behaviors. However, just imagine the difference a parent might feel hearing their child described as walks around the classroom making loud noises and disturbing other children, versus sometimes becomes anxious when there is a change of routine, which usually results in a stimming behaviors such as moving around the classroom or humming to himself. The challenges box is probably one of the most important boxes on the learning plan, even more so than the goals because it influences so many other sections of the learning plan. For example, the adjustments that we will talk about on the next page should link to the challenges listed here. Similarly, the goals should also link to one or more of the challenges. If not, one would have to question, why are we working on a skill area that is not presenting some sort of challenge to the student? Which brings me to one last thought for this section. This box is where we list the challenges faced by the student whose name is on the top of the learning plan. It is not a place to document the challenges that the teacher, the teacher's aide, the peers, the parents of the peers, etc. are facing because of this student being in their class. Remember earlier when I said that the first page of a learning plan is a good snapshot of the most important background information that someone new to the student needs to know? Well, this is probably the most important box for a relief teacher to look at when trying to get to know a student. The key recommendations box is the place to write down all of those adjustments that you make for a student that the student couldn't get through the day without. These are the things that will make or break the student's day. For example, I know of a student who needs a few minutes in the classroom at the beginning of the day, before the other students are let in. If this doesn't happen, it's very likely that this student will not make it through the rest of the day without some sort of crisis. Therefore, his learning plan has a bullet statement in this box that says, every morning so-and-so will be led into the classroom at 8:35 a.m. by a staff member to read a book or to use his sensory kit. There is no minimum or maximum number of bullet statements that have to go here, just so long as all of the key things are covered. Okay, now let's look at the adjustments. Earlier I said that the goals should link to the challenges listed on page 1. Similarly, the adjustments on this page should reflect the NCCD level of adjustment on page 1. The key thing to remember on this page is that the adjustments listed should include the frequency, intensity, and duration wherever possible. If and when your school is scheduled for an NCCD audit, the team will start to form an opinion about the level of adjustment this student needs based on the information provided on this page. Sure, the disability and challenges on page 1 will be important, but the NCCD is all about documenting the adjustments being provided and producing evidence to prove the adjustments are actually happening. Recently, I had the opportunity to review over 150 plans, and the majority of them failed to adequately reflect the level of adjustment because the bullet statements on the adjustments page lacked detail in general, and more specifically, the frequency, intensity, and duration. The best way to add detail in your adjustments is to identify specifically when a particular adjustment is needed, what that adjustment involves, and how long it needs to be provided. For example, when supporting a student who uses Braille, your bullet statement about having a TA to convert all written text to Braille might read something like this. An average of 2.5 hours a week is needed for the duration of the school year to convert written text into Braille, ready for the following week's lessons. This bullet statement clearly identifies the frequency, each week, the intensity, 2.5 hours, and duration, the whole school year. One note about this page that might make things a bit easier. Don't get too hung up on which of the 6 boxes to put a particular adjustment in. For example, would you put a statement about preferential seating to address a sensory issue in the environmental or personal care, health, and well-being box? Technically, it could go in either, so don't waste your time trying to work out which one is the best. All that really matters is that it goes on the learning plan. The transition considerations box is where you document any adjustments related to the times of transition. This might include things that happen daily, such as transitions between tasks, transitions between the classroom and specialist lessons, or the transitions that take place at the beginning and end of each day. Additionally, transitions may also include extra support needed when moving from one grade level to the next, or from one school to another, as well as camps and excursions. Don't forget that you can also include things like communication between home and school, meetings with specialists, and similar things in this box. As with the special considerations for testing and the NCCD boxes, if there's nothing that needs to be written in this area, please indicate this by writing NA in the box. Now on to the dreaded goals page. Over the last 5 years or so, this is where we, as a system, have been focusing the majority of our attention. While this is still a vitally important area, the NCCD has now made it equally important to have clearly identified challenges along with adjustments that demonstrate their frequency, intensity, and duration. The first thing to note is that above each SMART goal is a box to record an overarching goal. This does not need to be as specific as a SMART goal and is primarily there to point us in the right direction. Over time, a series of SMART goals will be written that take us through each of the smaller steps needed to reach the overarching goal. One of the things that I've noticed over the years is that the current skills and performance box is often filled in after the SMART goals have been written, and they're often very airy-fairy. In reality, this must be the very first thing that you do before you even decide what your SMART goal is going to be. After all, how can you know where the student needs to get to if you don't know exactly where they are right now? This means that it's really important to have detailed information here. For example, if I were to write that Johnny's current skill in maths is that he has trouble counting, what would you write as a SMART goal? It's pretty hard to know exactly where to go from there, isn't it? However, is it any easier if Johnny's current skill was written like this? With assistance from an adult, Johnny can count to 20 with one-on-one correspondence using concrete materials. Key to all of this is the use of data to make things very specific. Once we know exactly what the student's current skill is, it should be much easier to decide what the next step should be to continue this skill development. For example, with little Johnny, we might look at extending his counting skills in a number of ways. We might like to see him independently counting to 20 with one-to-one correspondence using concrete materials, or we might like to see him to count to a higher number such as 50 using one-to-one correspondence using concrete materials with adult assistance. We might like to see him count to 20 with one-to-one correspondence with adult support, but without using concrete materials. You can see that the goal is directly related to what has been written in the current skills and performance. So, the goal I'm going to focus on is this. Johnny will independently count to 20 using one-to-one correspondence and concrete materials. Great. Now we know where we're going, but is it a SMART goal? Nearly. It's specific, independently count to 20 using one-to-one correspondence. It's achievable, and it's realistic. We know that it's realistic and achievable based on previous experience with Johnny. However, we need to add another detail to ensure that it's SMART. How long does Johnny have to achieve this goal? We haven't stated that yet. However, we can easily add this element with something like by the end of term 2, or after a 6-week intervention, or something similar that sets a time limit. This is how I'm going to write Johnny's goal. By the end of week 6, term 1, Johnny will independently count to 20 using one-to-one correspondence and concrete materials over 5 consecutive trials. Some of you might be wondering if it was necessary for me to add the over 5 consecutive trials to the goal. Ask yourself this question. If Johnny independently counted to 20 using one-to-one correspondence and concrete material on one occasion, has he met the goal? What if he did it on 5 out of 15 attempts? Has he met the goal? By wording it as I have, it's clear to me and everybody else who reads the goal exactly what Johnny has to do to meet that goal. Is that clear as mud? If not, remember that your student support coordinator is always there to lend a hand if you're not sure if you've covered all the elements of a SMART goal. Okay, we've nailed down a SMART goal, so now we need to document how Johnny will be taught new skills to allow him to achieve the goal. That's what the strategies box is for. to list the key elements that will be used to teach the student new skills. The bullet statements in this box should demonstrate a progression of skill development and the scaffolding that leads to mastery of the skill identified in the SMART goal. Too many times this box just rehashes some of the adjustments listed on page 2. For example, it's not uncommon to see things like one-on-one support or extra time in this column. This information is fine to include, but they aren't strategies. It's true that Johnny might get extra practice each day with an adult, but this is part of a much bigger strategy that probably includes explicitly teaching some counting strategies, gradually fading the adult support, and similar sorts of strategies. When it comes down to it, ask yourself this: does what I've written in this column tell others how I intend to move the student from the current skill to the SMART goal? This is probably one of the easiest boxes to fill in. At the very least, the teacher and student will be included in this box. In many cases, the TA and parent will also be included, and in certain circumstances, there might be people from other support agencies that need to be included. For example, if the student had a sensory impairment, a specialist might be part of the team supporting the student and have some responsibility towards helping the student reach the goal. Okay, so we've identified Johnny's current counting skills based on data and then wrote a learning plan with a very specific goal. In this column, we want to document what we will be using as evidence to say whether or not Johnny has met the goal. So just a reminder that Johnny's goal is, by the end of week 6, term 1, Johnny will independently count to 20 using one-to-one correspondence and concrete materials over 5 consecutive trials. What data do I need to collect to determine if Johnny has met his goal? What tools can I use to gather this data? First, we need to gather data about Johnny's attempts to independently count to 20 using one-to-one correspondence. I might get this data by testing Johnny once a day, say on a Monday and a Wednesday and a Friday, or some other similar schedule. The point being that I am gathering data on a regular basis. Second, I need to know what tool I'm going to use when gathering the data. It doesn't necessarily matter what the tool is, so long as it measures the skill being addressed and that it provides consistent results. In this case, I might ask Johnny to count a group of 20 or more objects and record his efforts on a tally sheet. This tally sheet might just include Johnny's results, or it might also include a number of other children who are working on similar goals. What matters is that the data recorded on this tally sheet then becomes the evidence that Johnny has or hasn't met his goal. So what should I write in this column for Johnny then? I'd put in tally sheet recording thrice weekly attempts to count to 20. In this final box, you will record the date and results when you review Johnny's progress towards the goal. Given that Johnny's goal only spans a 6-week period, I might decide to look at his tally sheet at the end of each week to see how many times he has independently counted to 20. This means that since there's no way Johnny can achieve the goal in week 1 because he will have only had 3 attempts, my first review of his progress towards achieving the goal won't happen until the end of week 2, once he's had 6 attempts. Regardless of when I do my first review, I will need to look back over my data gathering tool to determine what progress Johnny has made and then record this on the learning plan. Let's say that I did my first review at the end of week 2 and Johnny independently counted to 20 on 3 consecutive trials. That's what I'd write in the review and date column, the date and the results. My next review might look like this: 19 March. Successfully counted to 20 without assistance on 5 consecutive trials. Goal achieved. Congratulations, Johnny successfully achieved the SMART goal you set for him. Unfortunately, the job isn't finished. In most cases, it means that we've just achieved one of the little steps towards reaching the overarching goal. So now we take the data that you just gathered on Johnny's counting and use it to inform the current skills and performance box of the next goal. Using this information, we can decide what the next SMART goal will be, and the whole process starts over again. As you can see in this visual, the process is very cyclical in nature, with the results from one goal informing the starting point of the next. In that way, we should be thinking about learning plans as an evolutionary cycle rather than the notion that we are writing a new learning plan at the beginning of each year. If done right, the first learning plan of the year should be an evolution of the last learning plan from the previous year. So we're done. Thanks for listening, and if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to see your student support coordinator.